Good morning, everyone. And again, thank you so much for joining us today. We're excited to be able to be with you on yet another webinar in this school safety series. Some of you are just getting back from summer break, and so for those of you that are just getting back, welcome back. We're so excited to have you with us today. For those of you that are actually with us, and I know a couple of you are, before you're even back, thank you so much for being with us, and thanks for coming back early, either just for this or for the day. And finally, for those of you that have been back for a while, a renewed welcome back, and thank you for joining us today and for being a part of the series as we go forward. Today's webinar is really focused on EpiPens and EpiPen preparedness. So what we're going to talk about today is not just how to manage EpiPens themselves and not just how to interact with and manage the students that go around them, but also how to respond to emergencies with them. And so although we're going to be talking about a couple of states specifically throughout the conversation, I invite you to share what state you're from. We do have folks from many of the 50 states, if not all of them. And so I invite you to share with us what state you're from and any specific challenges that you may have. And for those of you that have been on this webinar series with us so far, you know how important questions are to us, and you know we really would like to get to every single one, and generally we do. In fact, on one of the first webinars that we did, we had so many questions that we actually are going to be opening up a follow-up broadcast that I'll be talking with you about towards the end of today's conversation. That follow-up is going to function a little bit more as a workshop than as a webinar, so that each of you has the opportunity to ask the individual questions that you have. But even more exciting, that will really be the focus of the conversation. So we'll put a couple of sample policies up on the screen, and this is all related to immunizations. So we'll be putting a couple of the policies up on the screen that some of you may have. We'll be talking a little bit more specifically about some of the changes, and again, we'll be talking about some different states. So all of that is just to say that we love your questions so much that if we don't have time to answer them in the time that we have set out for today, we will create another venue or environment to do so in the future. But enough about that. My name is Chris, and I am the CEO of Joffe Emergency Services. And Joffe works with schools from Los Angeles to Boston to New York to the Bay Area of California to really prepare and equip them to manage emergencies of all sizes. And one of the things that we know is that emergencies really do come in all shapes and sizes. Some small, involving only one person, and those are the ones we're really going to be focused on today. And so what today's conversation is really talking about EpiPens and how the emergency or the anaphylaxis of one student can be managed. But we also deal with large-scale emergencies, so everything from lockdown to large-scale earthquake to hurricane to tsunami. So we evaluate and we look at each of those emergencies, and we do so based on the geography, right? So based on where you are within the country and what emergencies you need to be prepared for. All of that said, our objectives in any conversation that we have are that you understand, you know, and you are informed about the changes that are going on, and that you know exactly how to apply those changes to your own school and your own community. We'll hop into the basics here. And real quick before we go into any sort of conversation, I always like to make sure that we all are on the same page. So what is an EpiPen? Who manufactures it? When do we use it? What the heck is this thing? And in short, an EpiPen is a pen filled with epinephrine. It's an auto-injector. And it's used to combat generally anaphylaxis. There are a couple of other times that it might be used, but in our specific conversation today, we're going to be talking about how it combats or treats anaphylaxis, which is a severe allergic reaction. Anaphylactic reactions can come from any number of things. Primarily with our students, they come from food allergies or nature allergies. Food allergies can be things like nuts or chocolate, shellfish. Some students will even have an allergy to eggs, milk, or some even may have an allergy to dairy as a whole. Nature allergies are generally going to be things like severe allergies to pollen in the air, things like bee stings or bug bites. They generally tend to be things that are found in the outdoors, and those are oftentimes things that can't be controlled or contained as well as food allergies can. And albeit it's very difficult to manage a 6-year-old with a severe food allergy no matter what, but it's a little bit easier, I'd argue, than managing that same 6-year-old with a severe nature allergy, especially if it's something like bee stings or something that really can't be controlled in the outside world. Well, who manufactures the EpiPen? There are a couple of different EpiPens on the market today. The most common is the one that you see on your screen, although there is a new player in town, and the new EpiPen is called the OviQ. We actually, in the last about 18 months, have found these to be really skyrocketing in terms of exposure and access and frequency, or how common they are out in the field. And so many of you may have experienced these OviQs, and it's AUVI-Q. What's really neat about the OviQs is that just like an AED or an automated external defibrillator, the OviQ devices will actually speak to you and will actually tell you what to do as you go through the process of administering the EpiPen. And so you'll pull off the cap or the sort of protective case that goes around it, and you'll go ahead and administer it to the student. But rather than having to guess or to look at the pictures or remember your training, the OviQ will actually walk you through with words how to administer the EpiPen. So that's pretty neat. And again, when it's used, well, we use it in anaphylactic reactions. We use it any time that a student might be displaying anaphylaxis. And one of the challenges that we also find ourselves dealing with is, what about adults? If you were with us last week, you know that all of the things that we do from the health office or health aid capacity really apply, or the authorization to do these things really applies to the students, and our ability to do them really stops there. Now, if your staff is certified in first aid, your staff has the knowledge and the training and the certification to help an adult administer their own EpiPen. And so if you have an adult on campus who has a severe allergic reaction and they experience it right here, right now, the health aide that you have on campus, or whoever it is that's managing the emergency response to that incident, very well may be able to assist the adult with the administration, but with a student, we actually have the ability to do the administration. And I'll pause and go on just a slight tangent here, and if you've been with us, you know that occasionally this may happen. But one of the things that I like to think about with the EpiPen and with students is that they should really help too, as opposed to just have us administer the EpiPen for them. And the reason for that is that if you can have a student wrap their hand around the EpiPen and administer it to themselves with your guidance and your support, then what you've done is you've actually allowed them to, in their own minds, administer their own EpiPen. And the results of that, oftentimes you don't know as the rescuer because they happen so far down the line. But one of the possible results of that, and the best outcome in any circumstance, is that you've done this, you've helped your student administer their own EpiPen, you've given them the confidence to be able to do it again, and that then you've not just saved their life this one time, which is great and neat and exciting and such an amazing thing to be able to do. But now, in 4 years, or in 10 years, or in 50 years, when the same circumstance raises itself again, they have the confidence, the knowledge, the training, and they're able to administer their own EpiPen to themselves. And so now you've saved their life for a second time. And that's just a pretty cool thing to be able to do. And again, oftentimes you don't know the outcome. You don't know that that's happened. A few times I've been given the honor of knowing that the fact that I helped a student or I helped a child administer an EpiPen actually resulted in them being able to do it themselves at a later date. And it's been a pretty neat feeling and a really great contribution to them, both to their own health and safety knowledge as well as their own ability to care for themselves. And so, tangent complete, but I would challenge you to allow your students to help in any capacity possible. Obviously, if there's a life threat, which oftentimes there is in anaphylaxis, the priority is to do everything we can to do so. So if that's what needs to happen, then that's what needs to happen. But if the opportunity presents itself and a student can participate, you've done even more good for that student. So with that, let's talk a little bit, and we're actually going to jump forward a couple of slides here, but we're going to jump forward to what are the chances. And for those of you that are looking at the PowerPoint after the fact. We're going to jump forward about 4 slides. What are the chances? The stats that we have are that 1 in 13 children under the age of 18 has a food allergy. Now, the challenge with that is that that's a lot. If you look at your student count and you look at the number of students that have a food allergy on your own school campus, there's a good chance that 1 in 13 of them has a food allergy. The question mark behind that, or the thing to really think about there, is, well, how severe is that food allergy, and does that allergy result in anaphylaxis or need an EpiPen to be administered in the event that the allergy is triggered? And there's still a little bit of a question mark to that. I did share with the group last week that was talking with us about the health aid program. I have one school that has an incredible number of students that have an EpiPen assigned to them or prescribed to them, and that have a severe food or nature allergy, so severe that they need that EpiPen, and in some cases the delivery of that EpiPen, it has to be almost immediate. I mean, incredibly quick. So one of the things that I'll challenge each of you to do is to take a look at your records, and whether you're using a system online to track your student health and wellness, which many of you are, and some of those systems are Magnus or CareFlow. If you're using a system like that, you should be able to automatically run this report. And if you're using a system that's offline, and you're using either FileMaker or InResonance or a program like that, you may still be able to manage the report. And finally, if you're using a paper system, you'll have to do some work, but you can still get there. Assess the number of students on campus that have a food allergy or a nature allergy, and then compare that with the number of students on campus that have an EpiPen assigned to them or prescribed to them. One of the challenges that we have is that oftentimes, although a student may have a food allergy, and it may be very severe, it may be life-threatening, and it may cause anaphylaxis, oftentimes they don't have an EpiPen prescribed to them, or they don't have one prescribed that's at school. And so what I'll challenge you to do is compare those two numbers and find out whether your students have an EpiPen on campus or not. The next thing that I'll challenge you to do, and we'll talk a little bit more about this a little bit later on in the conversation, but is to make sure that you don't just have one EpiPen on campus, because one tends not to be enough. I like to think of a minimum of 3 for any elementary school student. So any student under really grades 5 or 6. And then I like to think of a minimum of 2, although 3 is still better, for anybody above 6th grade. If they're an elementary school student, there should be an EpiPen in their classroom. So their primary teacher should have an EpiPen assigned to that person for that child. There should be an EpiPen in that student's backpack so that they can actually carry it from class to class with them if they are moving, going to a specialist as opposed to the specialist coming to them, or if they're out on the recess yard or out eating lunch. And then there should be one in the front office. And that way, if it's after school or any other time the regular teacher is out for one reason or another and there's a sub in the classroom, whatever the case may be, we have a centralized place to come to, and we know that we can find an EpiPen there. If it's an older student, say 6th grade or above, 2 is the absolute minimum. Again, 3 is always better, but 1 should be on the student's person, whether it's in their backpack or in their pocket. For girls, if it's in a purse, wherever that is, it should be with them, and they should really be asked to keep it with them at all times. And then the second should be in the front office. And the challenge that we have, of course, with students as they get older is, for many of us, the students actually begin to move from class to class, and there's no longer that central point. There's no longer a central teacher that could manage that EpiPen. And so if that's the case, then that's fine. You can drop that 3rd EpiPen. Although if your parents are in a habit, because they've been with you since the early grades, of bringing 3, certainly take it, use it, and it can go to a coach. It can go into another centralized location if your facilities team is very active and very much a part of your emergency response program. If you have a leadership team that's very involved and very active, perhaps your head of school or one of your division heads. And of course, if you have a health office in place, then the health office, as opposed to the front office, is a good place for that second one to be. Although, if you've got both a health office and a front office, then that's a reason to have a 3rd EpiPen available on campus so that both the front office and the health office can have one. Now, why is it so important that we have all of these different EpiPens all over campus? Well, there have been a couple of court cases. Now, this all started several years ago, and when I say this all started, I will sort of for the rest of this conversation be referring to the late push of EpiPens and the knowledge and training and protocols that surround them. But that all really took hold in 2012 when we had certainly not the first and certainly not the last tragedy that occurred, but a student was exposed to a food allergy that she was, of course, allergic to, and the EpiPen on campus couldn't be located, and as a result, that student was in some pretty serious danger. Things like this happen very, very regularly, and in part it's because those EpiPens are not broadly available enough. We don't have enough on campus, and we don't have them assigned to the right people and to the right places. In part because parents don't bring them in. And so again, going back to that comparison between the number of students that you have with a severe food allergy and the number of EpiPens you have on campus can help you try to figure out if you actually have the right number of EpiPens for the right number of students. And finally, they happen because of a lack of confidence. And one of the ways to combat that, and in fact it's incredibly easy to do, is just to make sure that you're providing some really good first aid and CPR training, and that during that training your students, or in this case your teachers, our students, are getting the opportunity to practice and to administer practice EpiPens on a regular basis. And whether that's once a year or several times a year, whether it's in the summer, in June, or sometime in August, doesn't make a huge difference, but so long as they're getting an opportunity to practice and they're getting an opportunity to do so on at least an annual basis, they should have the confidence to actually administer the EpiPen itself. Now, in August of 2013, in the state of California, we saw a major change take place, and that major change was that we went from having what's called a prescribed EpiPen policy for all of our schools in California to having a generic EpiPen policy allowed with a prescription still for all of our schools. Now, the important distinction there is that when we have a prescribed EpiPen allowed, or rather a generic EpiPen allowed on campus, it's just that. It's allowed. It's not required. There are also states that say that an EpiPen or a generic EpiPen is required on campus. And finally, there are states that say that EpiPens are not allowed to be generic and therefore to be bought by the school or acquired by the school and kept on campus for anybody. And incidentally, on the screen, both on the reaction slide as well as the articles and court cases slide, you'll be able to take a look at some of the court cases, and if you're looking at or would like to have a little bit more information on the background or how some of these conclusions were drawn, of course, please feel free to let us know. We'll jump into the requirements, though, and again, what I'm going to talk about right now is states where a generic EpiPen policy is allowed. Then we'll jump into a little bit later in the conversation states where a generic EpiPen policy is required. And finally, then we'll talk about states where, again, it's neither allowed nor required, and we don't have the ability to have a generic EpiPen policy. So what do we have to have in order to have a generic EpiPen? In fact, what is a generic EpiPen? Well, a generic EpiPen is an EpiPen that's assigned or prescribed to the school. And so the school has this one EpiPen or these 10 EpiPens. In some cases they have many, in some cases they have very few. There are certainly formulas in order to find out how many you ought to have, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. But the school says, all right, we're going to take EpiPens on. We're going to have some generic EpiPens on campus. These are going to be used for any student that has any anaphylactic reaction. Problem solved. One really important distinction that I just want to make sure I share with you now is that these generic EpiPens, if they're allowed, if they're required, if they're present, even if they're neither, are not for teachers or staff. They're only for students. But what do you need in order to have a generic EpiPen? Well, you need a medical director or a physician. So in order to allow this process to take place, in order to allow you to acquire an EpiPen, in order to allow you then to use that EpiPen, you absolutely must have a medical director or a physician in place. In the last couple of weeks, we've talked a couple of times about medical directors, and certainly as they interact with your health office and your EED program, they can be valuable. I don't want to give the impression that they're a necessity for every single school, because they certainly aren't. But they are very helpful, and when it comes to specific policies and procedures and things like our EpiPen laws, they can be, in fact, necessary. So a medical director or physician must absolutely be in place. Now, what do? Your medical director in this case is just going to write a prescription for the school that says, hey, you're allowed to have an EpiPen. And if you need to use it and administer it to a student, you're allowed to do just that. You have to have staff training. So one of the challenges that naturally comes with a generic EpiPen program is that you run the risk of the wrong person getting the wrong medication for the wrong signs and symptoms. If you have a student who comes running in off the playground, looks really, really red and flushed, their cheeks are swollen, they're sweating really, really badly, and they're struggling to catch their breath, that could be anaphylaxis. It could be the first day of soccer practice. It could be a student who's been running around for far too long. It could be the beginning of a cold. And so when you look at a situation like that and you go, well, do I want to administer the EpiPen or not? Does it make sense, or is it actually more dangerous to do so? I'll challenge you to give yourself a couple of scenarios like that and go, well, would I administer it or would I not administer it? Well, then I'll challenge you to do that in an emergency. And in fact, I won't challenge you to do that in an emergency, because it's a difficult decision to make, and it's not one that you want to have to make in an emergency. It's a decision that you want to have already had made for you, or you already want to be prepared to go down the list of steps that you absolutely need to in order to make the right decision for that student. So staff training is a must, and it can come in several different ways. The way that we run our first aid trainings, and actually this week and next week we are conducting thousands of CPR certifications and first aid certifications for schools all over the country. And as we do those, one of the things that we do is we actually take the EpiPen segment and we review it at great length during first aid, and we challenge our site contacts, whoever that person is, whether it's the facilities team or the CFO or the business office or the head of school, to actually explain the EpiPen policy as it stands for your school. And so for those of you that have actually trained with us in the last couple of weeks or are planning to in the next couple of weeks, stay tuned for that, expect to do that. And know that if your policy isn't fully developed yet, that's okay. What we want to do is we want to share the policy, and we want to make sure that every single person on your campus knows the policy, is comfortable with the policy, and is able to manage and respond to the policy, and obviously to behave accordingly. We, during that training, will also ask each student to administer a practice EpiPen to themselves, and sometimes we'll even administer a live EpiPen for the benefit of the group. That's not every time, and certainly not something that we have our students do. But one of the challenges that we find a lot of folks have with EpiPens is this desire to draw their arm all the way back and swing it like a hammer and or like Pulp Fiction. And that's just not necessary. It's an auto-injector, and so it has the ability to inject the epinephrine automatically through skin, through clothes, through anything that the student may have on their body, almost anything. Football pads probably excluded. But it allows us to administer that medication by just lightly pressing it. And so every once in a while we'll do a live EpiPen demonstration just to help reiterate that point. And we may even share some video of a test like that in the future, or of a demo like that in the future with you guys. So certainly if you'd like that, let us know. You've got to have parent buy-in. Now, you've got to have parent buy-in for a handful of reasons. Obviously, if your parents don't approve, you're in trouble. But more so, you have to be relatively careful about how you have this conversation with your parents, because if you have this conversation in a way that allows them an out, allows them to save some cost, and allows them to reduce their liability, and not so much financial or legal liability, but just their liability as in, I forgot to bring my EpiPen to school, they may respond differently one day than they may respond the following year or the following day. So when you broach this conversation, if you have a parent safety committee, I would start there. If you have a parent team of any sort, whether it's a team that works with your head of school or with somebody else on campus, but they're a group of parents that you can trust and that you can come to and say, hey, can you help us strategize how to have this conversation with a larger organization of parents? The questions that you want to ask are, do you think that this is a logical decision for the school? Do you think that we have the resources available to ensure that all of our staff and all of our faculty are adequately trained on using the EpiPen and using a generic EpiPen? Do you think that we have such a high number of students that is or may become anaphylactic that it makes sense for us to have a generic EpiPen on campus? And how financially challenging is it for you to actually go out and acquire 3 EpiPens a year for us? Because one of the other challenges with EpiPens, and this is more from a parent voice, is that they're expensive. And if you're a parent and you have to buy 3 for the school and 3 for the house and 1 for the car and 1 for the soccer coach and 1 for the piano lessons, these things add up, and they run anywhere from $100 to $500, sometimes with insurance, sometimes without. So certainly if you're buying 10 of them a year and your average EpiPen spend is $5,000, you have a vested interest in the school acquiring a generic EpiPen and allowing that program to go forward. But the way that I would ask the question is, do you think, or do you find that you're financially able to manage acquiring your own EpiPens or not? And if you have a large percentage of your parents that are not able to financially sustain that cost, that may help, and that may be a reason to move towards a generic EpiPen program. Now finally, and this is the most important question of all, does my state allow me to have a generic EpiPen program in place? Oftentimes, the answer is yes. Oftentimes, the answer is no. And again, whether you sit in required, allowed, or not allowed at all has a big impact on how you're going to manage your next steps out of this conversation. And we'll come back and talk a little bit more about that, and of course how to find out whether your state requires, allows, or otherwise. The last thing that you'll want to think about if you're investigating a generic EpiPen program is the policies and procedures that go along with this. So do I have the necessary policies and procedures in place to allow me to actually do this? Do I have the stuff that I need? Do I have the documentation that I need? Do I have the prescription that I need? Is my physician approved to be a school medical director? Do I have all of these different things in place that absolutely have to be in place? And if you can answer yes to all of these questions, you've got a medical director, you've got the staff training, you've got the parent buy-in, you've got the policies and procedures, and of course your state allows you to do so, then it may be a wise decision for you to move towards the generic EpiPen program. Now, if you're going to, I would recommend a minimum of 3 EpiPens per location that you're going to store them, and I would settle for 2. For those of you that we work with, I like to ask for a little bit more. So I would settle for a minimum, I would ask for a minimum of 3. I would settle for 2 EpiPens per location. Now, what I mean by location is a minimum of 3 in the front office, a minimum of 3 in the health office, a minimum of 3 somewhere accessible from and to the recess yard or the playground, wherever that is. If you have multiple playgrounds, that means multiple sets of 3. If you have multiple campuses, of course, that means several sets at each campus. But then once you've put your EpiPens in place and you've said, all right, well, we're going to put 3 in the front office and 3 in the health office and 3 in the, let's say, the shed out by the athletic field, then what I want you to do is to think, well, if it were 4 o'clock on Wednesday, could I access an EpiPen in one of those 3 locations? And maybe for some of you the answer is yes, I could access it in all 3 of those locations. And if that's the case, great. Then ask yourself, well, if it were 8 o'clock and the play was just getting out and a student went into anaphylactic shock, now could I access it in all of those 3 locations? And then ask yourself, well, if it's 7 o'clock and it's a Sunday morning and we're all out for practice doing one thing or another, now can I access all of those locations or at least one of those locations? And once you've done that, you've actually vetted and checked to see that your locations are suitable and sustainable and accessible, then go ahead and acquire the EpiPens. And when you do, you'll want to purchase not just the adult EpiPen and not just the child EpiPen, but both. Oftentimes we get the question, well, can I give a child EpiPen to an adult? Can I give an adult EpiPen to a child? The answer is no. By policy, by protocol, you should give the appropriate aged EpiPen to the appropriate aged person. So for adults, you should administer the adult. For children, you should administer the children. In general, 8 years old or so is about the point at which we transition from child to adult. And so if you've got a middle school and a high school, there's a good chance you actually won't need the child prescription or the child EpiPen, which is great. If you're an elementary school, then there's a good chance you'll need both. Now, who administers the EpiPen? And incidentally, I'm seeing a ton of really good questions coming in. I'm going to give you guys about 2 minutes to share with us any questions that you have regarding the generic EpiPen laws, because I want to make sure that we answer those before we move on to talking a little bit more about the traditional program. So I'll give you guys about 2 minutes to ask any questions. Remember that question panel is on the right-hand side of your screen, so go ahead and ask away.
So Chris, there's a bunch of questions here from our listeners. Ellen has a question about the expiration date of June 15th. Does that mean we have until the end of June to get a new one, or a new one needs to be brought to campus by June 1st?
Excellent question. So generally speaking, the EpiPens, and this is actually particularly true with the older style EpiPens, they'll expire a month and a year, just like that. So June of 2015. You do have until the end of June. And one of the questions I get a lot is, once an EpiPen is expired, can I still use it? The answer is no. And I think that makes sense for everybody. But occasionally people will say something like, well, what if I'm on that Knowles trip and I'm in the way back country and we're 45 minutes away from the hospital? And the answer there is you need to make the best decision that you possibly can with the information that you have. Now the challenge there is that I'll tell you a little bit of information right now, and that is that in general, EpiPens don't quote-unquote go bad the day after they expire. So July 1st, that June of 2015 EpiPen would probably be just fine. The only people who I would ever say could use that on a regular basis, or who I might, on air say it was a semi-okay idea for them to use it, would be a parent group, because parents are, of course, the most responsible for their own kids. And so if they decide that something makes sense that maybe doesn't medically make sense or legally make the most sense, we might allow them to bend that rule a little bit. Whereas with you, as school professionals and some of you medical professionals, the answer really has to be no. But again, that said, we, in the backcountry, 45 minutes away from any sort of medical support, a student with anaphylaxis, you may have to make a really good decision. Now, to answer that question, again, yes, you have until the end of the month that it expires. And on the new OVQ EpiPens, if you see, or they're actually called OVQ auto-injectors, if you see an expiration date that says June of 2015, you still would have till the end of June of 2015, although those are starting to have more dates. So it'll say June 7th, and of course then that means you need to get a new one before June 8th.
Great. So we also have another question by Jennifer. She's confused by the medical director physician. Does this person need to work for the school?
Great question. The medical director or physician definitely does not need to be an employee of the school. What we find a lot of times is that the school will set up an independent contractor type relationship with the medical director. And so the person will be responsible for a series of things, and really, of course, we can help you come up with a list of what those things ought to be. So far on this school safety series, we've talked about the first and probably the most important being the AED prescription and oversight. The next is prescribing the EpiPen to the school. Some other things that they may help with are managing custom medication programs. If you ever have a student who needs to take medications during the day, it's always better to have a medical director who signs off and says, yes, we can administer this prescription throughout the day. And yes, it's safe for us to do so in a school environment. But it doesn't necessarily have to be overseen, whereas an EpiPen program always must be prescribed, and an AED program always must be prescribed.
Okay, great. And Josh has a question about generic EpiPens. If a student goes into shock, is it illegal to use another student's pen to administer to the student?
Josh, great question. And this is a difficult answer. So illegal is always a funny term when it comes to healthcare because there are things that we're not allowed to do, but I struggle with calling them officially illegal. That said, EpiPens are prescribed to now either a student or an individual person or to an organization. And the only intended use for that medication is for the entity or the person that it was prescribed to. So administering an EpiPen to a student that it's not prescribed to, for example, if I were to administer an EpiPen that was prescribed to Timmy to Tommy, that has some ramifications that may come up. The first is that if Timmy now needs an EpiPen later on in the day and I've used his in order to help Tommy, I've just taken away his access to his own resource. There have been a couple of court cases in recent years where Timmy's parents have actually sued, not because something happened, but because had something happened, it would be very dangerous for him. And I won't share those specific court cases with you, but you can Google them and certainly pull those up. The other challenge is that if Timmy's EpiPen is given to Tommy and Tommy doesn't have a prescribed EpiPen, there's a chance that Tommy's actually allergic to epinephrine. There's a chance that Tommy can't have it for one reason or another. Either he has some type of congenital heart challenge, which is certainly a possibility, or other type of challenge or disorder that prevents him from being able to be prescribed an EpiPen. And all of these are things that would only be known at the physician level. And so at the school, we may not have access to this type of information. And for that reason, it's really best that we only administer the EpiPen to the person or to the entity that it's prescribed to. You've heard me say entity a couple of times, and that's because if an EpiPen is prescribed to school A and school B runs across the street and says, hey, can we borrow your generic EpiPen, the same rules apply.
So there's a lot of great questions, and Ellen has a question about how many EpiPens per student need to be kept on school grounds throughout the school year. I think you addressed it a little bit, but I don't know if there's a specific number.
Great question, Ellen. So in short, 3 EpiPens for any elementary school student and 2 EpiPens for any middle or high school student. And the reason for that is we really want to have 3 available, 1 in the backpack of an elementary student, 1 in the front office for the elementary school, and then 1 in the classroom. And then for a middle or a high school student, we have 1 on the person, right, so 1 on the student, and then 1 in the front office or in the health office. Great question, Ellen.
Okay, and Katie's asking, are unlicensed school personnel able to administer an EpiPen to an older child, or does the child need to do it?
Great question. So, Katie, it's a challenging question only because of the way the law is written. But yes, unlicensed school personnel, and unlicensed referring to unmedically licensed, so somebody who's not a nurse or an EMT or a health aide, they are allowed to administer an EpiPen, but they're allowed to do so, or rather to help with the administration of that EpiPen, not actually administer it. So to be fully compliant, the sort of language is you want to wrap your hand around the student's hand, help them administer it, conscious or unconscious, whether you're quote-unquote helping them or actually helping them, but you don't want to actually administer it for them. And again, if you help them administer it, then that comes with all of those benefits that I talked about earlier, where later in life they're able to administer it themselves with a little bit more confidence and knowing that they know exactly what to do. So great question, Katie.
And Chris, we have a couple of questions from the same question from a couple of people, and they're trying to figure out where can we find out the requirements for our state on generic EpiPens, and specifically they're asking about New York and California.
Excellent. So both New York and California have a generic EpiPen allowed clause, and so for those 2 states, you are allowed to have a generic EpiPen in place. so long as you meet the requirements on the screen. So you have the medical direction, you have the parent buy-in, and that's not necessarily a law, it's just something that you ought to do. You have the staff training, which is a law in both states, and the minimum training for that is first aid certification. And you have the policies and procedures to back up the program. So in both California and New York, those are the requirements, and the statement or the law is that you have the option to procure a generic EpiPen. For any other state, you can contact us by emailing us at support@joffeeemergencyservices.com, or at the end of this webinar, we'll actually give you an opportunity to request an assessment, and somebody from our team will actually come out and work with you and walk around your school and get to know your campus and talk not just about the EpiPen program, but really about all of your safety needs. And from there, we can also help you figure out whether in your state it's a requirement for you to have an EpiPen, it's a choice, and or it's not a choice at all for you to have a generic EpiPen. So great question.
And finally, Joan is asking if we have a template to request parent permission for the generic EpiPen procedure.
Great question, Joan. So we don't template very much at Joffe, but we certainly can help you create a program or a request form. And we'll talk in just a second about some of the things that you absolutely need to do if you're going to go down the line of having a generic EpiPen program. One of those is to get the approval of the parents. Several schools that we work with have input the generic EpiPen clause into their handbook, and so when their parents sign off on the student handbook at the beginning of the year, their parents are also signing off on the ability to maintain and use a generic EpiPen. We also have schools, and they tend to be schools that are using online student database or student health and wellness databases like Magnus or CareFlow, and those schools will sometimes input a separate form that parents have to sign off on that says, yes, my student can have a generic EpiPen administered, or no, they can't. And so for schools where you might have a congenital challenge or you may have a special population that you already know about, that may be the best way to set yourself up for success and to really set the students up for success. And certainly if you'd like some help building one, the best thing to do would be to have us do an assessment with you, and we can certainly walk you through the process, either in that assessment or following it, of creating some language and creating a form that would allow you to get parent approval and parent buy-in, and also make sure that we're staying compliant. So excellent question, Joan.
So Chris, it looks like those were all of our questions. And again, if you still have a question that was not answered by Chris, please put it in the question box to the right, and we'll get to it before the end of the presentation.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Elena. So just a quick word about the traditional EpiPen programs that many of you may have in place. And at this point, they're sort of considered the classic, or the EpiPen program that if it's not a generic EpiPen program that ought to be in place. You still should have parent compliance, and parent compliance really means that they're turning in those 2 or 3 EpiPens based on the age of the child. You still should have staff training, albeit it's not necessarily a requirement for most states for you to be CPR and first aid certified, but it is certainly a best practice, and it's a way to empower your staff to respond and manage emergency situations that come up. And again, we're not just talking about EpiPens or anaphylactic reactions when we talk about first aid certification. We're talking about managing things from heart attack and stroke, and oftentimes those things actually impact our adults on campus as opposed to our kids. We're talking about things like managing smaller scale reactions, smaller scale allergic reactions, or heat strokes, cold emergencies, CPR, of course, using an AED. So that staff training is really an important piece, and again, it's not necessarily a true requirement, although if you work with us, we'll tell you that we really, really want you to be CPR and first aid certified, and we'll work with you in any way we can do so in order to get you and your full staff certified. And then finally, you still do need to have policies and procedures. Any medical treatment or provision that you have in place has to have policies and procedures behind it. We talked a little bit last week about the AED policies and procedures, and we'll actually be talking in more detail about them next week. And so as we continue the conversation, you'll hear us continue to say policies and procedures, have them in place, have them in place. And so we'll continue to work with you on helping you understand what needs to be in place, but ultimately there should be a health program documented and policies and procedures for everything that you do related to the health and safety of your students. So next, let's talk a little bit about who administers the EpiPen. And this was a great question that came up. And again, nurses, EMTs, and doctors, they're trained, they're licensed, they're certified, whatever the case may be, to administer the EpiPen, and that's excellent. But everybody else should be trained and should be capable of administering an EpiPen as well. Teachers and administrators on campus should know how to do it, and at minimum, if you contact us or most of the first aid providers out there, I would imagine that they could set up an EpiPen only course, and we actually have a few clients that do that with us on an annual basis. Basically, the process or the class that then is set up is, oftentimes a half an hour or an hour long, but it's a very intensive course where we're talking about just epi and just anaphylaxis and how those things relate to one another and how we manage reactions and things like that. So at minimum, that should be a training that you go through, whether it's, again, with us or with anybody else. And frankly, if you're a nurse or you have a school nurse, that person is often capable of providing that training, and that's a good way to do it for no cost at all. And then finally, students. So in this particular case, students are not the best people to administer the EpiPen to another student unless they are first aid and CPR certified, in which case there's no reason for them not to do so unless, of course, there's a teacher or administrator around who can. But the student themselves should be empowered and capable of administering their own EpiPen. And it looks like there are some more questions coming in. We'll answer those here in just a second. So let's talk for just a quick moment about maintenance and storage. Long story short, we've talked about how many you should have, how often you should replace them. This is, of course, going to be based on the expiration date on the EpiPens that you have, but can also be and should also be based on the sequence of your years. So if you can get EpiPens, and especially if you're doing the generic program, if you can plan to have them shipped to you sometime in August, then those should last you through the entire year, and then you can request new ones sometime in the early summer and have them shipped again in August. They tend to last for anywhere from 12 to 18 months, although there are manufacturers that make EpiPens that last a little bit longer, and of course there are EpiPens that last a little bit shorter or not quite as long. It's not an English sentence. Where should they be kept? So again, we've talked about the locations on campus. But now the next piece of this is that EpiPens are a medication. So they shouldn't be exposed to temperatures higher than 120 degrees or so. And they really shouldn't be exposed to like freezing temperatures either. So when you look at where specifically to store them, in general, anywhere indoors in a classroom, in an office, in the health office is going to be just fine. And if you look at places outdoors like an emergency shed or a supply shed, so long as it's air conditioned and somewhat temperature controlled, those places should be fine as well. If you're in, Southern California, where the temperature really stays at about 68 to 75 degrees all year long, oftentimes those outdoor sheds work. If you're in other parts of the country where you do experience freezes and/or you experience extreme heat, which every once in a while I suppose we see in Southern California here, then you really need to be a little bit more careful about the specific location. The next question that people often ask is, what do you do after they're used? Well, anytime you administer an EpiPen, you should be calling 911. EpiPens are short-lasting medications, so they last anywhere from 10 to sometimes 45 minutes at the very most. But when they wear off or when they no longer are working, the student goes back into anaphylaxis, and so, or the adult for that matter. And so certainly some students will have 2 EpiPens. They'll have a first dose and a second dose, and that's a good way to manage this challenge. But better than just relying on those is calling 911 and making sure that you've got somebody on the way who has another method of giving the same medication. Believe it or not, when the paramedics get there for an allergic reaction, they're actually going to administer epinephrine. They'll administer it a little bit differently. Oftentimes they'll either draw it up in a syringe and administer it in the shoulder or in a muscle, or they'll administer it in an IV, so they'll actually get direct vein access, and they'll administer it that way. But either way, when they get there, they're giving the same thing. They're just going to do it a little bit differently. And they may also give some Benadryl IV as well, and again, through that vein access that they may get. But either way, when they get there, they're going to have the ability to titrate that or to administer that over a course of time until that person gets to the hospital, at which point they'll actually treat them almost the exact same way. But what's really important is that you're never in a situation where you run out of epinephrine, when in most cases you only have 1 or 2 doses, and you also don't have the fire department or the paramedics there quite yet. That's a big challenging or a big challenge that can be faced if you've got long response times. And again, if you've got long response times or you expect that it would take the paramedics a long time to get to you, then you'll want to have some extra doses available, and that's something that should be written into your policies and procedures. That begs the question, how many EpiPens can you administer? 2 is really the best case max. You shouldn't be administering a whole lot more than that, but you do have the ability to administer a couple more if it's written into your policies and procedures and your medical director approves it. And finally, you should always have them on the go and accessible if you're ever on a field trip or if you go to an outdoor education program or anything like that. They really should be accessible and available in those environments as well. So I'm going to hop through and briefly talk about the risk, and then I'll come back and answer a couple of questions that we're seeing come in. In terms of steps that you need to take in order to implement an EpiPen program, whether it's generic or not, there are a couple other things that you'll definitely want to do, and the most important is check in with your insurance company. And in fact, we oftentimes will do a similar conversation to this, and we actually will partner with an insurance company. Today we don't have an insurance company with us, and in fact the reason for that is because we're talking with the entire nation. So there's so many different insurance companies and so many different programs that one or the other might recommend versus absolutely despise. And the big item that it boils down to is check in with your risk management team and have them check in with your insurance company to make sure that they are on board and approve the program that you're putting into place. For example, in California and New York, where it's very clear what we have the capacity to do and that we can create a generic EpiPen program, some insurance companies still say they'd rather not see that. And if so, if they have to, because your school says we're going to do it anyway, they'll have very specific policies and procedures that we want. Now, a couple of quick questions to answer. Can somebody on the board provide the mandated medical direction? Absolutely. If you have a physician board member, they tend to do it for no cost or very low cost, and certainly they can be the medical director. If you have an insurance company that is a third party, which most of you do, I would still challenge you to ask your insurance company if they're okay with that. It does bear a little bit more risk if somebody from your board is the person that's signing off on the medical direction, because they do have a vested interest in the school's success. And so that can be something just to be cognizant of. And the last question that I'll answer that many of you may find yourself thinking is, what happens if we use an EpiPen on a child or on an adult who doesn't need it? I oftentimes, as I said, will do this EpiPen demo where I use a live EpiPen and I inject it through a piece of cardboard and show everybody what it looks like and sounds like and how far the Epi will actually travel and how quickly it does. And so if I were to accidentally inject myself when doing that, certainly that would cause some problems. My heart rate would go way up. I'm not sure that my arteries would handle that, but it more than likely wouldn't cause much more harm than a trip to the hospital and a lot of pain and maybe some tears. That's true for children and for adults, so long as there's not a heart defect that's in place already. If you have an unstable heart, then Epi, which actually accelerates the speed of the heart and constricts the vessels in the heart and throughout the body, it's not a great idea to administer it, and in fact, if it's not needed, it can be a real big challenge. Now, of course, then that begs the question, what if I need to administer an EpiPen to somebody who does have an unstable heart? And the answer to that question is you need to administer it because it's going to save their life, so go ahead and do it. But again, if they're not in anaphylaxis, if they're not in need of it, then it can be scary, it cannot be great, it can be even a little bit detrimental to their health and wellness, but in general, not something that's overly complex. So we're going to fast forward to actually the last 2 slides here. We will send out this PowerPoint as we've done with the previous webinars, and we'll also send out, of course, the webinar recording. So you'll have an opportunity to see some of these other slides that are in place. And I would challenge you to use those risk management slides really to ask the questions and to help you figure out what questions need to be asked rather than as the Bible that you use to create your program. And so the biggest and most important thing that these next several slides say is check in with your insurance provider, check in with your legal counsel, and make sure that you're doing this compliantly. Now, in each of the webinars that we've done on this series so far, and in every one that we'll do in the future, there are a couple of things that we want you to know. Of course, your questions are important to us, and we'll continue to answer those questions in just a moment. And if you think of questions that you didn't have a chance to ask, please feel free to email support@JoffeEmergencyServices.com and or schools@JoffeEmergencyServices.com. And through either of those two venues, we'll get an answer out to you. And you can actually click the link on your screen now if you'd like to test that out. It's schools or support@JoffeEmergencyServices.com. Now, in any setting where we talk with a group of people, albeit 1 or 1 million, we like to ask you what you thought. So if you could take a moment to fill out the survey on your screen, and we'll go ahead and chat that out in the chat panel for you right now as well. Please just give us your thoughts on how the presentation today went, what you thought that was great, what you thought that wasn't so hot, and then also please take a moment to share any thoughts about topics that you'd like us to cover in the future. We're committed to holding this webinar for you every Thursday at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, and sharing with you not just health and safety related issues, although pretty much just health and safety related issues, but issues that you find yourself facing on a regular basis at school or on school campuses. Albeit some will be adult focused, some will be child focused. The bulk of them will be related to health and safety of your staff and your students, because ultimately that's what we're here for and that's what we're responsible for. So please take a moment just to share your thoughts on that by clicking that SurveyMonkey link. And finally, for your participation today and for those of you that have been with us for the last couple of webinars, we've actually gotten to speak with some of you. We'd like to offer you a free assessment. Basically, an assessment is an opportunity to talk with one of our school safety experts and really evaluate your school safety program. And again, that can be focused on a specific area if you feel like it needs to be, or it can be really taking a step back and evaluating the entire health, safety, and wellness program of your school from an emergency preparedness standpoint, a disaster preparedness standpoint, and a regular health and safety standpoint. We work with schools on things from as isolated as a single student fall to as large scale as an active shooter or a person who doesn't belong on campus. And so we are honored and thrilled to be able to have that expertise and really want to be able to share it with you. So you can click that link that's on your screen now. We'll also chat that out for you so that you can sign up for that assessment if you'd like. And again, that'll be at no cost to you for your participation in this webinar. That does it for today. Now in just a moment, I'll answer a couple of more questions for you. But I'd like to invite you to sign up either by way of the same email you got for this or the link that we'll chat out to you in just a moment for the future webinars. Next week we'll be talking about emergency preparedness on day 1 and some of the things that absolutely should be in place before the start of the school year, and for some of you may not be until a little bit later in the school year. So I'd love to invite you to that, and then throughout the year we'll continue to talk about things. AEDs will be coming up shortly. How you run a fire drill, how you run an earthquake drill, how you run a lockdown drill will be coming up in the next couple of months. Emergency communication systems used from text messaging to PA systems, health-related issues like immunizations and things to that effect. So continue to share with us your feedback on what we should be covering, and you can bet that you'll see it at some point throughout the year. So again, I'll answer a few more questions here in just a moment, but thank you so much to everybody who was able to join us today.
Great, Chris. So we have a couple of questions. Annika and Valerie had asked the same question about disposal of used EpiPens, unused and expired, and used EpiPens.
Oh, excellent question. So used EpiPens, after they've been administered, I mentioned earlier, and may have gotten off track, but I mentioned earlier, you always call 911 when you use an EpiPen. And basically, when 911 gets there, you'll just go ahead and give them the EpiPen that you used. They'll place it into a sharps container, and they'll take it away, and from that point forward, it's off your hands. You don't need to worry about it. If you don't call 911 for some reason, the EpiPen still does need to go into a sharps container, and I can't really think of an environment or an example of a time that you wouldn't call 911, so albeit this is a rarity, but if that's the case, you can put it into a sharps container on campus or wherever you are. And finally, if you have expired EpiPens, you can do a number of things with them. We actually collect them when we provide our CPR and first aid training for our schools or when our consultants are on site. And so if you have expired EpiPens, we're happy to take them from you. Of course, you'll need to take any names or prescriptions off of the EpiPens or of their case that they're in. And what we do with those is we actually use them during real trainings, and we do those demos that I was talking about earlier. So it gives people an opportunity to see what Epi actually looks like and what the process looks like. I would warn you that you should not do those demos. You should make sure that if you'd like to have a demo like that at your campus, that you call us, and we can certainly help arrange that for you. But you should not do those demos because Epi is a dangerous drug, and if administered to somebody incorrectly, or one of the things that could happen is that it could end up just actually hitting somebody, and that's the Epi that shoots out of the end of the EpiPen. It can be very dangerous. Eyes, oral intake, the whole 9 yards. But the first time I did the EpiPen demo, I didn't realize that the Epi might shoot out 15 feet ahead of me. And fortunately, I was just doing it for practice, so it wasn't quite a big deal. But I would say don't do that yourself. Call us and let us do it for you. But finally, if you don't want to give them to us for one reason or another, you can turn them in at a local hospital and they'll collect them from you, or you can give them back to the parents and they can take them back to their doctors. So those are some options for used, or rather for expired EpiPens. And again, for used ones, the best thing to do is just hand them to the fire department, or if you're going to take the student to the hospital, you can hand them to the hospital as well.
Great. So Emily is asking, how does one determine whether or not to administer Benadryl or Epi?
Good question, Emily. So long story short, if it's an emergency situation, Epi is the drug that we'll want to administer, because Benadryl is something that, although it can be relatively quick, tends to take between 10 and 50 minutes, depending on the type of Benadryl we're giving, liquid, pill, capsule, etc., before it gets absorbed by the body. So if you're seeing hives develop and you're seeing the students start to be scratchy and itchy and a little bit bothered by those, then certainly Benadryl might be a good option. But if you're in an emergency setting where the student's having a difficult time breathing or it becomes unable to breathe, then your only option is going to be Epi. And the reason for that is that Benadryl just takes too long. Now, I mentioned earlier that certainly the fire department or the paramedics, when they get there, might administer Benadryl as well. But the reason for that is that they're going to administer it through an IV. So the body is able to pick up and absorb and use that Benadryl a whole lot more quickly than an oral intake of Benadryl, no matter what type it is, even liquid. If you're looking at a student who's ever having a difficult time breathing, that's obviously a real current, immediate, emergent life threat. And so Epi is going to be the way to go. And if you're looking at a student who's just developing some rashes or perhaps woke up this morning after being bitten by a spider overnight and is a little bit bothered by that bite, and that's been the case for 45 minutes or an hour, then you may just administer a little bit of Benadryl. Great question, Emily.
Okay, so Shirley's asking, where on the body are they supposed to administer the EpiPen?
Oh, great question, Shirley. So in spite of all of the things we've talked about with Epi, we haven't actually talked about how to administer it. So the EpiPen is delivered to the lower back part of the thigh, or I should say the mid-back part of the thigh. And what we're really looking for is that stuff on the back of your leg. And I joke that on me it's probably the fatty part, on you of course it's the muscly part. But it's that stuff that sits there on the back of your leg. And that's where you want to administer it. And basically, if you take your hand and you put it in your pocket, right about where your ring finger touches, that's about the right spot. And it doesn't matter whether it's the right side or the left side, and it doesn't matter whether it's up or down by a couple of inches, just so long as it's in the side back part of the thigh there. And of course, then that begs the question, well, what if a student doesn't have legs, or if the legs are somehow occupied and trapped, or whatever the case may be, and I can't administer it to the legs? And the answer to that question is then you can administer it in the right part, or the right or the left part of your shoulder. And of course, I put my right hand up and thought that, but just at the edge of your shoulder where there's that little bit of muscle tissue and sort of stuff there, that's an option. Now, it's not nearly as good as the leg because the EpiPen needle is pretty long. It's a little over a ½ inch long, and so when you administer it, especially if it's a young child, there's a good chance that you'll end up actually hitting the bone, and that's not a good thing at all. The other challenge that you have up there is that there are a lot of nerves that cross there at the top of the arm, and so if you hit a nerve, it can also be problematic. And that's the reason that we don't do anything in the back end, we don't do anything in the belly, any of those other areas that we might administer other types of medications, or in a hospital setting we might even administer this medication. There's just too much going on for us to appropriately place it. So we're going to say the outside part of the leg, in that fatty or muscly part of it, and if that's not an option for some reason, just the very top of the arm there, right where the shoulder meets the bicep or so.
Okay, great. And so finally, the last question is from Claudia. Can a health aide use a nurse stock EpiPen if the nurse is not there?
Good question, Claudia. So assuming that the nurse stock is referring to a generic EpiPen, absolutely. A health aide, a school administrator, a school teacher, the student themselves, they absolutely administer a generic EpiPen whether or not the nurse is there. The only thing that I would think about in that situation is if the nurse isn't there, is that the right medication? Can we verify it in one way or another? Is there any chance that I might be administering the wrong medication? One of the challenges that we have with EpiPens is they look a lot like these new pens that have come out for seizures that are actually a different type of administration altogether. And they look a lot like these pens that have come out relatively recently for migraines that also are a different purpose altogether. And the challenge, of course, is that a migraine pen is designed to actually open up all the blood vessels and to reduce the blood pressure and the heart rate. And an EpiPen is designed to constrict all the blood vessels and to increase the blood pressure and the heart rate, because that's the challenge going on with the allergic reaction. And so the two, an EpiPen and a migraine pen, are actually polar opposites in terms of what they'll do to the body. And if you were to administer the wrong one in the wrong time, you would make the problem worse as opposed to better. So long as you're sure that it's an EpiPen, and so long as the policies and procedures allow you to do so, there's no problem at all. Just double check that it's the right medication, that you are allowed to give it to a student, and you make sure that it is prescribed to the school as opposed to a specific student. I don't see any problem with administering without the nurse there.
Okay, great. So that does it for all of our questions. And as Chris mentioned, you will be getting some more information via email. This will be, the whole entire presentation will be sent to you. And if you do have other questions, feel free to email us. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Chris, for presenting this wonderful information, and we hope to see you next Thursday.
Thank you, everyone.